Welcome to the Stories of School Leadership podcast, the podcast where we elevate the voices of and create connections between inspirational leaders from the UK and around the world. I'm Emma Lurie, and thank you for joining me as I share these journeys, inspirations, and stories of education, leadership, and life. In this episode, I get to speak to the absolutely fascinating Dr. Jo Trevenna, who is a former head teacher and is now writing a book about an idea called Carnivalesque Leadership, which is so interesting. We dig into joy, connection, community, happiness, laughter, loads of really important ideas for educational leaders in all sectors actually, and how we can be strategic in our planning of events and ideas, and how we can understand the value of some of these things. So this is a really great episode. I was completely fascinated all the way along, jaw open stuff, so I hope you love it as much as I did. Let's get going. Jo, it's so fab to have you with me. I've just said off record that I'm really excited about this episode, and I am, because I think the topics that we're going to get into are genuinely fascinating. I have no idea about them, but you're going to tell us all about it, which is great. But just tell us a moment, where are you in the world? Who are you, and what do you do at the moment?
Sure. My name is Jo Trevenna. I am based in Milton Keynes and have always worked around this area as well. I am currently a consultant. I do lots of different things, but they're all tied together with a key theme that has really driven my career right from the start of leadership through to headship, and now is predominating what I do on a day-to-day basis with my consultancy work. So there are some decent themes that I'd really like to explore with you today.
Right, we're going to get into it. So, because I'm nosy and I'd just like to know, maybe there's some threads from kind of earlier on in your childhood and career. What was your own schooling like, and how did you then get into education?
Well, at the risk of being quite stereotypical, I didn't really enjoy school. And I think that might be quite a familiar theme that you're seeing in some of these discussions. So I felt uncomfortable in the school that I was in, both primary and secondary. Felt awkward. I think I have a bit of an awkward personality, awkward demeanour at times. I really felt that as a child. Everything's accentuated, isn't it, when you're a kid, because you haven't got much to compare it to. It's not like you've got a lifetime of experience where incidents only take up a tiny proportion of time.
Yeah.
You know, everything that happens in school, because you have a narrower sphere of time, is huge, isn't it? And so that experience was mixed. However, I made some amazing friends. And I remember some key teachers that had such an impact on me. And that was one of the drivers really to get involved in teaching later on, because I did return like a bit of a pigeon to one of those schools to teach. And so that was quite interesting.
Amazing. So did you always think you wanted to teach and go into education? Was that kind of your life plan?
No, I
Oh,
left school. No, no. I left school at 16. I really did feel that somebody like me didn't really stay on at sixth form, and certainly didn't go to university. And so I took a break from education till I was 21. And then I thought there's got to be more, because literally I was doing some really dodgy jobs around Bletchley High Street, pretty much every retail unit in Bletchley at various points. But it just didn't feel enough, Emma, and I just wanted to explore things. I'd always read. I've been an avid reader. Bletchley Library was a haven for me, and my mum was a keen reader, and she always encouraged things like that. So literature was very much something I wanted to explore, and I took a huge gamble, as it felt, by doing some evening classes, again at Bletchley College, and it took me 2 years to get my first one, which is English literature and language. And I still remember the moment where I opened my results envelope on my own in my car in the middle of nowhere, not really knowing what this meant actually. And I did well. And that feeling remains an important moment for me, because it kind of changed my perspective on what I could potentially achieve. And then I started to explore, what could I do at this point? And it was all new, first generation through, if I was going to go to university. And so I thought, okay, I want to do another one, because then I might be able to push this and see how far it goes. And so I picked art history, and I loved it. It melted my head in so many ways and really opened things up for me. So I did those two A levels. It did take some time to do that, and then I took the plunge and I went back to university, and joyous. I mean, completely out of my comfort zone, beyond belief. I was older than a lot of the other people there. They all seemed way more confident and way more straightforward than I felt at that point. But it was joyous. And some of those ideas that I discovered doing that English and history degree, actually, I keep forgetting that I did history sometimes, but I did history as well. But there was cultural studies in there, and I was exploring some really big ideas that have stayed with me, and I'm now having the opportunity to really explore in writing a book. So all of those things very early on made a difference, and have shaped increasingly the themes that have been dominant in my leadership and also now my academic work.
What a beautiful story. I think, like, you know, to know that you had that little gap, because I think for so many people, they feel like their journey into something like university or other has to be that, you know, we go straight from school and you go through it naturally as step. But lots of people share a really, it's not squiggly, it's normal, but we need to normalize the fact that actually it's totally fine to have little breaks. And I remember not having an absolute clue what I wanted to do when you go to those career fairs when you're about 15. I think, oh, I don't know. I just want people to pay me money to ride horses or something back then, I think. But yeah, that's amazing. And that, yeah, I can really resonate with that idea of that recognition that actually you can do it and you can achieve it. And clearly you got the bug for academic
I did.
studies,
yes.
because you went on to do a doctorate at some point, did you?
Yeah, so what happened was I had this absolute joyous experience in university, which isn't the kind of most people's experience of university, or one that's not really discussed, because for me it was very much about being exposed to ideas and different forms of literature and philosophy. And I'm really sounding nerdy, but I don't care. Now I'm 52. I am a nerd, and I wish I'd embraced it a lot earlier. But so all of those things were so important to me, and I thought, well, I don't actually want to stop, because this feels so important to me in terms of just opening up the brain and letting stuff in. And so I had a wonderful opportunity to do a studentship to complete a PhD, and I wanted to take one of the themes from my final dissertation and to expand it more. So I went straight from doing an undergraduate degree to doing a PhD, because I wanted to explore that theme. And that theme, again, was one that has developed into something that I'm now going back to explore. And so that's exciting that I can return to some of those big ideas that I didn't necessarily exploit enough when I was doing the formal research, but now I can do that. And part of the leadership work that I've done in schools also feeds into that as well. And so sometimes I say to people, I do too many different things, but I don't think I do. I think they're all connected, and I think they're connected in lots of different ways. So, for example, I have the absolute privilege of doing some work around diversity and inclusion. I do that. I do some work around leadership. I am writing this book on Carnivalesque leadership, which sounds like something completely different. I'm doing research into a Russian philosopher, which sounds like something completely different, but they're not. Essentially, they are all joined together. And it's exciting to see how that's taking shape in the book.
Yeah. Wow, it sounds fascinating. So, and we're going to dig into this idea of carnivalesque leadership. This is the thing. I have no idea what it is, but I'm desperate to find out. And before we properly dig into that, just tell us a little bit about your kind of experience in schools. I know you've been a head teacher. So kind of just a little quick recap of that, because I'm sure those experiences, again, like led you into this fascination you've got at the moment.
Absolutely. So I started teaching when I was doing the PhD. Wonderful people enabled me to facilitate some workshops and then to deliver some lecture sessions, and I loved it. I then started to run some undergraduate courses, which again was such a absolute joy. Felt completely out of my depth, complete imposter, etc., etc. There's a theme clearly that's running throughout this, which is fine. And so that teaching thing started to happen. And then a friend of mine, we met up, and he said, you do know there's a job at the school that you went to? And my first response to that was, no, 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 didn't have a good time, really bad memories, etc., etc. And then very quickly I thought, well, what if? And I did it. And in true me fashion, I went through quite a tortuous route, which is at the time a GTP route. Which is nothing like the fantastic programs which are now available for on-site apprenticeships, for example, are so fantastic in terms of what they offer. It was a bit different for me back in the day, but I did it, and I met some amazing people, wonderful colleagues, and I started to redress some of the baggage in my own head from my schooling, I think, by returning to the school. I'm not sure it was necessarily helpful for my line managers at times for me to chip in about what it used to be like in the day. I think I might have been quite annoying at various points, but it was a joy, and I stayed there for over a decade. Had a great time, really enjoyed it. Reached the point of assistant headship after being head of sixth form. I did some work on learning and teaching, which was joyous. But then I wanted to do something else. I knew that I needed to experience another school, because I'd started to think, okay, well, perhaps I do want to do more leadership work in a school, and to make as much of a difference as I can. So I then moved schools, did 1 year of deputy headship, and then I became head of school in another local school to me, which again had an emotional pull for me. It was probably too early to take on the first head role, but I wanted to do it because of that specific school. It was another local school to where I grew up. Some of my mates went there, and I wanted to really make a difference. So that was the first shift to headship. It was a wonderful experience, absolutely was. Again, met some fantastic people, both the kids that you work with and members of staff that you work with. Wonderful community, really joyous. So that was my first headship. I then did a little bit of interim work because I wanted to see how that felt, and it felt quite different. And I wanted to then recommit to a school, and that was my second big headship, which was very different, a much bigger school. And that was during COVID, and there were some difficulties around that time, as you might expect. But again, such really rich experiences that I took out of that. And some of the work that we did at that school was around how to build a real sense of joy and belonging, and passion and drive and character, which again is part of the themes that I was talking about, the things that kind of connect some of the work that I'm doing now around belonging and diversity and inclusion. All of these things really did inform my headship there. So that hopefully that gives you a sense of my journey to this point.
Yeah, what a rich experience so far. Okay, so let's get on to Carnivalesque Leadership then, because I have no idea what it is, but I
Okay.
feel like it's going to be fascinating, and I think it's something I'm going to want to find out more about.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Emma. Thank you for the build up to that. So, Carnivalesque leadership, the idea is really taken from a Russian philosopher called Mikhail Bakhtin, and it's just a tiny little fraction of his work. His breadth of scope and his depth of understanding around different philosophy is huge, and this is just one tiny little fraction, and I've extrapolated it out in a way that may upset him, may upset some people generally, because it's a bit bold what I'm trying to do with this, because I wanted to see, well, what happens if you really focus on the idea of carnival, if you focus on the idea of festival and feast and joy and laughter, and it's how it operates as a kind of safety valve in society. And if I think back to my own schooling, both in terms of a pupil and in terms of my teaching and leadership career, there are moments that stay with me, which are about the moments that we release tension from an organisation. Now, I think that you need to do that in any organisation, no matter how strong, how well established, how much the culture is really clear. Because when you've got people working together, there can be a point. And it's about strategically making sure that you don't reach a point when the pressure starts to really impact on people. And I don't just mean stress at that point, I mean literally the day-to-day operations. Yeah. So where do you get the break from the norm? Where is the safety valve put in place? we think back again to education, things like non-school uniform days play a huge role in letting out pressure. Not always successfully, I have to be honest.
It puts more pressure on the staff because the kids are wild.
Yes, well,
But I love this idea.
Because you're releasing tension.
Yes.
And you tend to find that if you can get through that day without too much drama, you've then got better compliance following. The children are in a different position, the staff may be in a different position, because you've actually let some pressure out of the system.
This is fascinating, Jo. I was having dinner with a colleague last night and we got onto some of this idea. So yeah, go on, tell me more. How can we get rid of the pressure? Because there's a lot.
There is a lot. And I think it is around being strategic. So if you think of big organizations, so an organization, a corporation like Google is really clear on the methods that they use, so that there are built into their daily structures moments where there is a release of tension. There is an increasing sense of the role of happiness around work environments. Now, there are loads and loads of complications around that, like genuine. It's a real problem to say, well, if you just increase happiness, then you get greater productivity, which is one of the arguments. I think there's something in that, but I don't think it's straightforward.
Happiness is quite a complex idea, though, isn't it? Because actually you can't make somebody else happy. You can and I think that's what you're trying to say about giving opportunities for. I like this idea of the pressure release.
Yes,
you can create those moments, but what you can't do is make somebody else happy, because that's personal to you, isn't it? So like, happiness is really hard concept to say you are doing. You need to be doing the joy and the pressure release, I guess.
Absolutely.
And then that hopefully results in happiness for somebody else, but that's up to them.
I also think it depends on how you see happiness. So
yes.
if you take Freud's idea, which is that happiness is a moment, then I think it is possible to generate moments of happiness, which sounds quite contrived, but I think that is a possibility. One of the things that Bakhtin really focused on was communal activities. And there is lots of potential around this to be strategic. So to build communal activities, they might be quite basic. They might involve food and drink. They might involve the way in which people simply socialize together. And if you think about the way in which we are getting far clearer about the role of chemical messengers like oxytocin, dopamine, endorphin, serotonin, so much of that can be created in a communal environment. So part of Carnivalesque Leadership will be looking to see how you create those communal opportunities. Now, all of this at the moment is all very well, but what Bakhtin talked about was how the subversion of hierarchy during these processes can make change. And that's the crux of this for me, is that we can say, if you undertake these components of Carnivalesque leadership, they will have an impact. They will release some tension. We know that that happens because we see it in everyday life. But for Bakhtin, what that can then do is actually reinforce hierarchy. It can reinforce compliance. So in the way that I spoke before about, well, the day after a non-school uniform day, you are likely to have more compliance because the pressure has been released. And that's a really simple example of how an organization or a hierarchy can use opportunities to release that tension and then be able to go back to as it was. That's one argument. I'm going to come to another one in a second, but I'm going to give you the big example, and the big example is Carnival itself. So if you think about Mardi Gras, if you think about the big, fantastic carnivals, and what happens then is that we have a pre-Lenten letting out. It's like the final hurrah before Lent, so that the pressure is released at that point. People have had fun, they've had communal opportunities to get together, and the tension in the pressure in society has been let out, which then enables compliance with Lent. It's that model that we're talking about, so that you can then go back and people are more compliant. They feel able to take part in whatever is required, because there has been something that's happened to let the pressure out of the system, to let it out. And so therefore, people are in a better position. They feel happier. Again, that really tricky term. They feel more ready, and they feel a sense of community, that they together continue in the way that they were. So that's one argument, which is just essentially about letting out pressure and then going back to how it was. Now, I'm really interested in a slightly different model where you let the pressure out, and in letting the pressure out, you are enabling change. So my final chapter in the book is around pride and the way in which pride started off essentially as a means to demonstrate political events, very much about the anniversary of the Stonewall riots, but that has become a carnival of sorts. And what I'm interested in exploring is what impact has that had, as an example, on the way in which society has changed? And has that had a contributing factor to long-term change? So Carnivalesque leadership is not simply about letting the pressure out of the system, but is much more than that. It's far more about what else can be achieved and the potential for change, huge change in society. And so that tension between short-term and long-term, I don't think necessarily has to be oppositional. And that may well be the conclusion to the book. No spoilers, but that's likely to be the case, is that it offers two very different things.
Yeah. I'm literally sat here. My mouth isn't actually open, but internally my mouth's open because it's so fascinating. And it's one of those ideas that when somebody helps you, thank you, Jo, to unpick it, it's one of these things that you think, well, I knew that those things were helpful, but I didn't necessarily know why. So, for example, we started before we recorded, just talk a little bit about joy and moments of joy. And I've been having loads of conversations with leaders recently who are feeling there's a lack of joy. You know, where has the joy gone from our jobs? And there's this underlying, well, it's not even underlying, it's on the surface feeling that being in educational leadership at the moment, being in education, you know, the joy's been sucked out. We are constricted to schemes of work and having to block. I mean, my friend said the other day she's doing something like 8 lessons in a day. The children are squeezed of everything. The joy feels like it's been sucked out. And actually, where is the time to put it back in? And we know that then when you do focus on some of those big events, those, you know, like Easter bonnet parades are happening at the moment. It's Easter now, we're recording, and I think there's a real challenge for educational leaders at the moment to know why those things are important. And this is a really fascinating way of thinking about it, because certainly because of the challenges of leadership, people are doing less of some of those things. You know, we don't have time to do those. Actually, it's, you know, the children are too wild on a non-school uniform day. Let's not do it. We haven't got time to make that big hook event where we, you know, took loads of time to decorate the classroom or something. We haven't got time to do those things. And I think we've forgotten why they're important, and we've almost undervalued them. But this sort of idea gives us really great research-driven, you know, understanding about the purpose of it. Because, like you said, there can be two, and I think probably two very valid and worthwhile planning them in reasons to do it. So is your idea around Carnivalesque leadership, would you talk about it that you can be a Carnivalesque leader? Is that an idea and a concept?
I think you can definitely strategize for it.
Yeah.
Because if you give credibility to the idea, then what you're giving credibility for is hundreds of years of the way in which society has dealt with some of its own pressure, and the way in which society has changed through moments of creating subversion, and the way in which hierarchies are challenged. And that has been happening since Roman Saturnalia, 12th night. You know, this isn't a new idea, and it's about understanding, well, this has worked, this has helped society. You know, why do we have these carnivals? Why do we have people getting together and having such an exuberant change from their normal routines? And it is so fundamental to enabling people to feel a sense of communal belonging in particular, and to reverse some of those hierarchies and expectations. And that's where some of the change can kick in. I think your point about the loss of joy in schools, I think that's a COVID element. I genuinely do, because we kind of fell out of the habit of doing some of the most normal things in school. And then you add the pressure of the catch up to enable the pupils to fill in some of the blanks that they've got, which is, you know, incredibly difficult. And we've lost that strategic focus on how we might do things differently. We've still got it in terms of the curriculum. So things like dance, drama, art, singing is wonderful when it comes to Carnivalesque release, for example, because those endorphins that get shoved out into the world, it's joyous. But alongside the curriculum, there has to be more than that. And so some of those days that we think about when we look back on our own careers, those days where, oh, for example, I remember one day, and it was in July, and wonderful school I was working at took most of the children off for the day. They went to Alton Towers, that kind of thing. But then there were some kids that were left, and there was some staff that were left. And I remember feeling at the time, well, they've got to have some fun. They've got to do it. And so me and my friend Sarah, we put on this event. I can't believe I'm saying this to anybody. And it was called Oops, There Go My Bloomers. And it was a kind of, it's a knockety knockout kind of event where the children had to do loads of fun activities. And it was a little bit bonkers and it was a little bit wild, but it did the safety valve release, because essentially you've got a bunch of children that have feel that they've been left behind. But we had a lot of fun, and there were lots of things that we got out of that. So that's just another example of something that I look back on and think Carnivalesque, and it had a real impact for me, and it had a real impact for some of my colleagues at the time, but I didn't have the terminology for it. I didn't have the framework. And that's really what I want to give people. So I think you're right, Emma, in terms of just that need to refocus on things like joy, because there's a reason why we miss it. You know, it's so important to us as human beings, that sense of belonging, that sense of community, that sense of real communal experiences together, which we need. We know that we need them. But again, I think that's part of the COVID legacy that we're dealing with and needing to work through. So my argument would be to strategize for that. I've got a slight obsession at the moment around form tutoring in secondary schools. I'm a secondary specialist. And I think that if a school wants to be really bold and really, really embrace the idea of belonging, so again, I'm joining up themes here around diversity, inclusion, a sense of that community. Form tutoring for me is a fantastic example to do things differently, to let some of the pressure out of the system. But that would take strategic leadership, and that is part of my argument, is there are opportunities still in schools, like there are in other workplaces, to make sure that you're putting on enough opportunities for that Carnivalesque leadership to have real impact. I suppose you always have to be mindful as a leader, because part of the Carnivalesque leadership is overturning your own hierarchy, and just letting go of the reins for a period of time, which not everybody will feel comfortable doing. And I think back of my career, there were some environments where I'd be really happy to do that, others less so, because the school was in a very different position.
Yeah. I think when you were talking about the idea of compliance following it, I felt a little bit uncomfortable, because there's that idea that actually, well, do we want compliance? And so when you started talking about then bringing change or being open, I guess, to having a flatter organization that's less hierarchical, that's a really exciting way of thinking about it, is having those. And I guess maybe from a staffing perspective, when we're thinking about Carnivalesque opportunities for children, but then what about our staff? What things can we put in place then for them to give them those opportunities? And I sometimes think, again, at the moment, because things are really challenging, maybe we are planning it for the children, but what is there for our staff? We know we're in a real crisis point in terms of recruitment and retention, and there's a huge wellbeing agenda out there that tells us that our staff might need yoga or biscuit. I mean, I've never seen staff run faster than when a certain person's made the brownies in the staff room. So we know that there's a nice little bit around snacks are great, but it's so much deeper than that. And it has to be so much deeper than that, doesn't it? Happiness doesn't just come from the biscuit jar being full. And so I guess what's your thinking around that for staff as a body? If you're thinking about being a leader and how you can bring these ideas in for your team, what would you talk to around that?
I suppose it's there are different layers. So there are some really basic things. So you're absolutely right about the cake and the cup of tea, and it always sounds really basic, doesn't it? And it always sounds a little bit superficial. However, it is the communal getting together, isn't it?
Yeah.
It is that sense of belonging, that somebody's cared enough to do this for everybody else. And it's more than just the brownies. It's what those brownies mean.
Yeah.
And that can be open to manipulation. However, at the same time, if you're being strategic and you want people to feel good, then to manipulate that opportunity, that's not a bad thing. It's just you're putting something which is really straightforward front and center of something you want to do for people. More longer term, it's about almost being really clear on the hierarchical structure that is in place, and the way in which that can be challenged. I would say usually in a controlled environment. So, for example, if you have a staff sports team, and I'm gonna switch focus in terms of a different working environment. So, a football team that is run by an office, and they've got their office football team, or a factory outing where you've got an opportunity to have a break from the norm. And it is that break from the norm that lets out the pressure from the system. So the way in which big factories used to literally put people on a coach or a train and take them to the seaside for the day. Again, that sounds superficial. However, it had huge impact in terms of how the staff felt valued. And also, again, it's going to come back to the same thing, letting the pressure out of the system, doing something very different. And then you go back to the same routines, but with the experiences that you've had. And so those experiences will then have potential impact into your day-to-day life. If you then think about the way in which the team building industry has developed, there are things that are done in all sorts of organizations, including schools, to build teams together. Essentially, again, you're going back centuries. You're having an opportunity for people to be together, doing different things together, and to understand each other better and to make an emotional connection. It's not always possible. We know that sometimes those can go horribly wrong. But again, it's about changing things. And I think there are opportunities to do this, which can either have a short-term impact or a longer-term impact.
Mm. And I mean, I was just thinking as you were talking about sort of leadership conferences that I've been on, and, it all gets a little bit chaotic because head teachers particularly don't have many opportunities to go out, get together, have a nice meal, have a few drinks, and it all goes a bit wild because it is literally that. It is taking the lid off. They're going, oh my gosh, I'm finally out. I can let my hair down. I can enjoy it. And I guess I was also thinking about different people wanting to do that in different ways and having that recognition that for some people, yes, big community, social, carnival type events will be really fantastic and joyous. And I suppose, is there that element of thinking about what other characteristics might need? Because for some other people, does actually just create quite a lot of stress, and what they want is a really lovely walk on the beach and something quite calm and different. I was thinking about some, as a head teacher, some team exercises or some events that we tried to put on, and there was always a few people who just didn't want to engage. So what do we do with that sort of
yeah, absolutely
disparity?
right, because I think I would have been one of the people that didn't want to do it. And there is an irony to me writing the book about what happens if you do this, because I think I would have been one of those people, particularly earlier on in my career, where no, I don't want to do that, completely out of my comfort zone with that kind of thing. But I can still look at the theory behind it and say, yes, there is value to this. But I take your point, absolutely. It is not for everybody, particularly the very brash, very in your face social events that can really challenge a sense of self and a sense of expectation. That's not going to change, and I don't think that Carnivalesque Leadership is going to pretend that at all. And these big events will appeal to some people but not others. However, there are some really basic things around this as well. So we'll go back to the brownies in the staff room. We'll also go to the idea that laughter actually is fundamental. Bakhtin himself talks about the healing value of laughter, and it doesn't have to be raucous, and it doesn't have to be bawdy, but it's just what laughter can do. And I think that there are some subtleties that leaders can put in place And it doesn't have to be Joey the clown arriving in big shoes on a Friday afternoon. It's just that human understanding that acknowledges that humour actually has a role to play in Carnivalesque release. Because if you think about some of the really tense moments in your life, and then somebody has said something funny, and the huge relief and release that you get from that, that's a very, very, very normal, very human response, which will actually let some of the pressure out of an individual system.
Yeah. And there's lots of research, isn't there, around laughing therapy and things like that. And I think you're right. And I guess it's, as a leader, it's tapping into knowing what your team needs, because what one person or group of people might find funny, takes the, lets the steam off, those sorts of things will be different. But having that knowledge and having those opportunities to be with people to find out what works for them, that's a step in it, isn't it? Knowing that actually what somebody would really like, yes, to go for a walk or spend some time reading a book, and what someone else wants, is a good old party. And having that recognition is really important, because it'll be slightly different for different people. And I've seen little things like, in a school I was at once, some of the teachers would put on different people's favorite music when we came into a staff meeting. We just sort of have a request, who wants their favorite music, and in that simple act, everybody can get some, some people go, oh my gosh, I hate this song, but then the next week they get their song, and then that feels lovely. And it's just a small moment of release, joy, positive energy. And you're right about building that connection. And I think that's something that COVID altered for people. I've definitely heard people talking about that shift in people as a team maybe not wanting to engage in some of these things, because they sort of had that opportunity of COVID where they didn't have to. And for some people, they quite liked that. And now getting back into doing some of those things, it takes a bit of energy. So having this research and having this knowledge gives people a good purpose and understanding about, actually, this is important because it's building our connection. It's giving us that opportunity to let off that steam. I think it's really great. It's giving us a why, isn't it, about why we should do it.
Yeah, I hope so. I think I view this first book as a starting point. And I am very keen to do some research in schools to see, okay, well, how can we judge this in practice? The book isn't just on education, but I do have an education chapter that goes all the way back to the 19th century, and starting to think about uniform, the role of uniform in the Carnivalesque, or in terms of hierarchy. Maypole dancing features very heavily in this chapter.
Does it? Tell us more about maypole dancing.
I hadn't realised how much of a global phenomenon maypole dancing is. And it was absolutely joyous. I mean, I've got no skin in this game. I am not a maypoler.
Are you not? Maybe you should be.
But it's just starting to see what kind of activities have been part of schooling and the organisation of schooling, which again does something differently. So it releases tension at certain points in the year, and it just changes the perspective, and it enables children to do different things and members of staff to do different things. So again, it's that breaking routine. It's something different happens, you let the pressure out of the system, and then you can then carry on. And so that chapter is very broad in its focus, because I talk about curriculum and opportunities within curriculum, and there will be subjects which are more obviously linked to the Carnivalesque and the way in which teams work together, which would be around sport and PE, it would be around dance and music, and the way in which they can offer Carnivalesque relief. And again, come back to your point earlier, it's not for everybody. So I was very, very keen on PE. I was rubbish at it as a child. I should have been much better at music, but I didn't really like it as much. And it's those kind of things. It's not going to be a neat fit, but again, it's those opportunities which build in the relief and the release in terms of what you might normally do. And even things like communal eating in school. Those social times are so important to many of the children, and those can be points of tension for members of staff, because that's when you may not necessarily feel as in control of what the children are doing. at the social times, because you've then got you've got a mass communal element going on, that may be having lots of fun, they're eating and drinking together, they're socializing together, they may be charging about together as well. But those kind of everyday things that happen in school, there are carnivalesque opportunities.
And I think this idea ties in really nicely to the very giant change that we need in education at the moment, because if we could make some big shifts in terms of curriculum and, you know, provision for our pupils who've got special educational needs and disabilities, if we could shift the finances slightly and the accountability, it would give us the time and the energy to focus on some of these things that are so important and they are getting lost, and we need to have a pause point and say, hang on a minute, let's shift the perspective a bit, so that actually our children and our teams in schools can take this time to look at these ideas. So when's the book going to be out? How does that all work? I've no idea about writing a book. And are you doing other things around it? You know, are you speaking at events? How are you getting this message out there? Because it's fascinating. People need to know more about it.
So the very nature of me means I need some sense of validity around this idea. So that's why I've started with a very academic book, because I wanted to do the research around the literature that's already out there, and to pull in some of these impacting factors, to make sure that I've got the academic credibility behind it, which is a lot about me actually, then feel the need to do that. I don't think I'm going to change, but I think that was important first. And then what I want to do is to take those ideas and run with them. So once I've got the academic book done, I then intend to go out and see how this can operate more in a slightly more anecdotal manner, but then working with organisations, not just schools, but organisations, to really explore where the safety valve mechanisms are for them, and whether or not that's working, and what impact is it having, and whether it's worth looking to see what other opportunities there are out there. Because if we then come back to the idea of long-term change or short-term reinforcement, I think that some philosophizing around those two things. So what is currently going on in organisations? Is it for compliance? Is it just to tick a well-being box? Or is it deeper than that? Are you willing to hear the voices that are currently being unheard? And that, I suppose, links into, again, to the idea that it feels like I'm doing lots of different things, but there are these links between all these elements that I'm exploring, which is exciting for me. So the book should be out latest January 2025. Deadline is the end of May. That's going to be tight. I've enjoyed it. I'm enjoying it more now than I was at the start, because, again, there's another theme here. It felt a bit impostery at the starting point, around me doing this book. But that's going now, because essentially
doing it.
I'm the expert. And so
yeah,
this is my use of a wonderful man's ideas, that will trouble some people's expectations around what Carnivalesque should be, but it's another voice, and it's another voice talking about the need to offer people a release, to relieve some of that safety, to relieve some of that pressure in a safety valve mechanism, which is done strategically rather than ad hoc. So it's not like suddenly feeling, oh, I need to take the staff to the pub tonight. That's not strategy at that point. Probably doesn't really tick that many well-being boxes these days anyway. It's not this. I remember at school, there was a real sense that the staff went to the pub on a Friday lunchtime, and Friday.
Yeah, that used to be a thing. We were just literally talking about that last night as well, like how that was a thing.
Yes, it was a thing. It really was a thing. So we wouldn't do that these days, but there are lots of different things that we can do, which embrace fun and community, and just that communal sharing of experiences, which can make a real difference to people.
Yeah. And it's so needed. We need your voice and the voices of other people talking about these ideas, because we are at this sort of precipice, I think. Things are hopefully starting to shift, and we need to know, okay, if things are going to be different, where do we put our focus, and where's the research behind some of these big ideas? So I have found it absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for your time. If people are interested in finding out more, where's best to find you? LinkedIn?
Yeah, LinkedIn.
Yeah.
So you'll see a range of things that I post on LinkedIn. Again, there is a theme that runs throughout them, and you'll see increasing posts coming up, probably after I've submitted the manuscript.
When you got a bit more time.
Which will be about Carnivalesque leadership in particular. But you'll note there's already some obsessions going on with form tutoring and DEI work on there already.
It sounds so great. And I think that's what people want, isn't it? They need, you've done this big job of work giving us the kind of the research and the backing and the understanding behind it, like you said, the academic bit, and then that next step into, well, practically, how do we put these things into place? And that is going to be so valuable for people. Thank you so much for your time, Jo. It's been absolutely fascinating. I feel like I need to go and don some sort of big carnival my headdress now and do some fantastic dancing around my little office.
Well, Notting Hill Carnival is on our doorstep, more or less, and it is the biggest street carnival in Europe. So, absolute joyous event.
Amazing. Well, they get a bit of inspiration from it. Thank you so much for your time, Jo. We'll put lots of links to kind of you and how to follow. And when the book is out, we'll get it out there, because I'm really excited to find out more and get reading.
Fantastic. Thanks, Emma.
Thank you so much for listening to the Stories of School Leadership podcast. We'd love to know what inspired you in this episode, so do get in touch and tell us your thoughts. And please share this with friends and colleagues. If you have time, a review would mean so much. It really helps us to reach more people. If you'd like to connect with me to follow my journey or access some support, maybe supervision, coaching or early years consultancy, you can find me at Stories of School Leadership on Instagram. I'm Emma Lurie on LinkedIn, or my website is emmalurie.co.uk. I hope you have a great day whatever you're getting up to next, and I can't wait to share the next episode with you.